Another very important Venetian artist is Jacopo Robusti, only we don't call him Jacopo Robusti, we call him Tintoretto. It's another one of those people who has a nickname. And the word Tintoretto, tintore, would be a dyer, like a dyer of cloth. And so he is known as Tintorette, the little dyer, which is, of course, his father's trade, not his. In his workshop, Tintoretto had a sign. And it said he combined the drawing, or the disegno, of Michelangelo with the colore, the color of Titian. In other words, the best of both worlds. He's saying, I can draw like Michelangelo and I can paint like Titian. I'll let you be I'll let you make that decision. He did not, however, paint with disegno. He painted with very free brushworks, and he used, of course, oil on canvas. That medium that is dominant in Venice in the 16th century. And here we're seeing the work that we're going to look at. It's one of his later works, finished in the year in which he died. And as you can see, this is a Last Supper. Tintoretto had a large workshop. Both his sons and even his daughter were painters. And Tintoretto worked very rapidly. His nickname was Il Furioso, the furious one, or the furious painter, because he painted so rapidly. In fact, Titian was supposed to have held him in disrespect and contempt because he painted so fast and he didn't charge enough. Well, Titian charged a huge amount. And Tintoretto maybe was able to get the prices down a bit because he painted very rapidly and was able to turn out a tremendous amount of work. And he developed a technique by which he had that dark ground. Remember, you have your canvas that is then coated with gesso and then applied a dark background. And on this dark background, he essentially painted the highlights. His painting style is extremely painterly. In other words, he paints with the very free brushwork. And when you look at this painting of the Last Supper, you can see the technique. You see the background, it's all very, very dark. And then just take a look at those angels flying in. Wait, we can see the rafters painted over the background. And then the angels, just the highlights of them, are painted over the rafters. So you can see the rafters through the angels. Well, that darkness in the background that's used for the darkest shadows, it's used for the background, that is the ground. In his paintings, he frequently uses a kind of exaggerated perspective with a strong diagonal movement. Here you see the table of the Last Supper going back at a dramatic diagonal into space, rather than, think of Leonardo having the table parallel to the picture plane. Here's the opposite. And he uses this very strong contrast of light and dark, which makes the picture more dramatic. He uses painterly brushstrokes, and you can see just those outlines of the angels, and through them, the rafters and the dark background. Everything is dramatic. Everything is excitement. Okay, why? Why in Tintoretto's paintings is there so much drama? Why is it so different than Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper? Why so different than Leonardo portrayed the Last Supper? Well, there's 3 reasons. I mean, he's a Venetian. And remember, the Venetians are very free with their brushwork. They often use asymmetrical compositions. It's also Tintoretto's own personal style, where he really exaggerates the perspective, where he uses this dark and light contrast and paints extremely freely. He also elongates the figures. In fact, in many books, Tintoretto is considered to be a Mannerist. For our course, I'll accept either Renaissance, late Renaissance, the Venetian Renaissance, or mannerism. Besides those two obvious reasons, I guess, I want to suggest another reason that the dramatic presentation of this painting has to do with an interpretation of the subject being the Last Supper. And so let's look closely at Christ. What is Christ doing? You see, he seems to have his hands very near the mouth of the apostle who's seated next to him. What he's doing is holding out the Eucharistic wafer to place it in the mouth of the apostle. This is the first time that the communion service has ever been performed. This is what we call the institution of the Eucharist, the beginning of the Eucharist. Now, the Eucharist, the word means thanksgiving, but it applies to the sacrament of the bread and wine. It's called the Eucharist, it's called the Mass, it's called Holy Communion, the sacrament of the bread and wine. And so this is the first communion. This is when Christ is first offering Holy Communion to his apostles. And you'll remember, Christ just takes the bread, he breaks it, he takes the wine, he blesses it. He says that the bread is this is my body, which has been broken. He takes the wine, he says, this is my blood, which is shed for you for the remission of sins. Do this in memory of me. And that is the institution of the Eucharist. And of course, the Christian Church continues this as one of the most important sacraments of the Christian Church. There's two sacraments that are considered to be saving sacraments, the sacrament of baptism and the sacrament of the Eucharist or Holy Communion. So I'm going to suggest that this dramatic style and the reactions of these people, who all seem to be very excited. We'll take a look at some of them in a minute. The dramatic composition all enhances the message of the painting. What's the message? Well, think about your history. What has happened in religious history in the century since Leonardo da Vinci painted his Last Supper in the 1490s, and Tintoretto paints his Last Supper, one of several I might add, but he paints Tintoretto paints his Last Supper in 1492 to 94, so at the end of the 16th century. There's Leonardo's. Very different than Tintoretto's. What happened? The Protestant Reformation happened. So what question we're asking here is, what impact did the Reformation theology have on the interpretation of the sacrament of the Last Supper? There's different interpretations of what did it mean. For centuries, the Christian Church had said that the bread and the wine of the sacrament were really, in some manner, the body and blood of Christ. They were under the appearance of bread and wine, but they were truly the body and blood of Christ. This is sometimes called the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. However, when the Protestant Reformation occurred, some Protestants denied that the bread and wine were really the body and blood of Christ. There's about 3 different opinions about that. The Catholic view, called transubstantiation. The Lutheran view. Luther thought that they were the body and blood of Christ, but they were also bread and wine, that they weren't just the appearance. They were bread and wine, but they were also the body and blood of Christ. That's called consubstantiation. They're both But some Protestants denied that the bread and wine of the sacrament were really the body and blood of Christ. Now, these were the Protestants that sometimes are called the radical Protestants. They go even further than Luther, away from Catholic doctrine. And sometimes they are called the low church Protestants. The high church are the Anglicans, Episcopalians, Lutherans, and the low church is like most everybody else, And they emphasized not the verse that said, "This is my body, this is my blood." They emphasized the verse that said, "Do this in memory of me." And so they said, it's not really the body and blood of Christ. It's really bread and wine. But it's a memorial service. We're supposed to do it in memory of Christ's death. Okay, remember, this is a time in which there is no freedom of religion. And people believed that what they believed was what God believed, and that if you didn't agree with them, and if you tried to convert other people to their new radical ideas, that they were leading people astray, and these people would all be damned. So this was a very serious matter. It wasn't, well, you have your opinion and you have mine. What did the Catholics say about this radical Protestant view? Well, they were horrified. And the whole Reformation horrified them. The whole Protestant protesting against the doctrines of the Catholic Church. And in the middle of the 16th century, they had a church council in the North Italian city of Trent. So it's called the Council of Trent. And this is a counter-Reformation church council. It's against the Reformation. And so we'd call the Catholics, who come after the Protestant Reformation, they're called counter-Reformation because they're trying to counter it and, show that these people were just wrong. And what they do is they reaffirm the doctrine of transubstantiation, the doctrine that says that this is truly the body and blood of Christ. So that word counter-Reformation, it means against the Reformation. The word transubstantiation, as you can see, it has substance in it. So it is the substance is changing, as it were. You have bread and wine. When it is consecrated, it becomes the body and blood of Christ. It changes. But of course, it doesn't taste like flesh or blood. It tastes like bread and wine. It smells like bread and wine. It looks like bread and wine. It has the appearance of bread and wine. But in some way, the substance of it, its true essence, has been changed. Now, when the Catholics called this church council, the Council of Trent, they did a number of things. One, they had to admit that there were some abuses. Well, simonry, for one, the selling of offices. So they passed some rules, saying you shouldn't be doing this. But then they reaffirmed the doctrines of the Catholic Church that the Protestants had challenged, the Protestants did not agree with, and said, yes, they are true. And one of these, of course, very central to the Mass, is the doctrine of transubstantiation, or the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. So they said the Protestants are wrong, this is true. Now, just think for a minute. Here's Tintoretto's painting. It's so dramatic, it's so exciting. Oh, and by the way, he's in Venice. And this church is in a monastery church, the Church of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. Okay, hint, hint. does Tintoretto's painting support the Protestant or the Catholic interpretation of the sacrament? Well, some of you said, he's an Italian. It's hanging in a Catholic church. Of course, it's the Catholic interpretation, and you're absolutely correct. But I think that you can tell that even just looking at the work of art, even if you didn't know who painted it or where it was hanging. So, this supports the Catholic doctrine of the miracle of transubstantiation. It like the Council of Trent, which had happened decades before this painting, it reaffirms the miracle of transubstantiation. No, it's not just a memorial service, it is a real miracle. So, how's that work? Well, you have all this drama, you have all this excitement that's conveyed by the style, the diagonal movement, the strong contrast of light and dark. And then, of course, you have figures who are, reacting emotionally. Let's look at some of this drama that's going on. And you also have these supernatural elements, such as the angels. And the angels are flying in on a diagonal. Or if you see what looks like a lamp, an oil lamp, if you look closely at it, you'll see that the smoke around it is angels. They've all come to this event, to this institution of the sacrament. And then we see how the apostles are reacting with surprise and devotion. And then there are the servants. The servants are reacting very strongly. As you can see, the woman is holding out a beautiful vessel that contains round white things. And the male servant here has his back turned to us, but he's turned around with this, he's raised his hand, the whole body language as well as his face express surprise. Like, whoa! And what are those round white things? Well, that is what a Eucharistic wafer looks like. They're round, they're white. It's essentially bread that has been pressed in a press mold, and that it melts on the tongue. Some of them will even have crosses and little crucifixion scenes and the Chi-Rho sign made into a cross. So they have, a variety of designs. These have no designs. They're just, white round posts, perhaps. And so we have them going, whoa, it's a miracle. And they're all going, wow, here there are angels have come in. So it's a miracle. Oh, I might tell you, where is Judas? Judas is in his traditional place, as you can see here, on the other side of the table from Christ, and everybody's kind of ignoring him because the point isn't who will betray me. The point is the institution of the Eucharist, the beginning of the Holy Sacrament. So all of this excitement is saying, it's a miracle. All of this supernatural elements, like the angels, are saying, it's a miracle. And of course, transubstantiation is a miracle. It's called a mystery. You're supposed to believe it by faith. You can't prove it. So Tintoretto is showing the institution of the Holy Sacrament at the Last Supper, according to Catholic doctrine, showing you that this is a miracle of transubstantiation. Well, let's look at another picture of the Last Supper, painted by another Venetian artist, as you see, about 2 decades before. This is by the artist Paolo Veronese. He came from Verona and then moved to Venice, where he worked. So he's considered to be a Venetian artist, but his name Veronese tells us his origins, that he is from Verona. So Paolo Veronese paints this huge canvas of the Last Supper. It is 42 feet wide. I mean, it is gigantic. And that actually is relevant. As you can see, he portrays the Last Supper very differently. It is taking place on a table that is stretched horizontally to the picture frame, right across the picture. And there is this extremely elaborate architectural setting. Remember, Christ was having his supper in the upper room, so I guess it's a rich guy's house. Surely. It could be, a rich guy in Venice's house, certainly. And you have Christ in the center. He's sort of leaning over like he's talking to St. John there. Peter's on the other side. The apostles are at many tables. There's a lot of other figures. Once again, there's servants around. And you must remember that the Venetians, I must remember, there's a lot of extras. There's a lot of servants and other people there. It was very popular in Venice to show the Last Supper with servants, that the rich man who had lent Christ his house, provided servants as well. So we have these three, wonderful arches. They're eating on a loggia. And here we're looking closely. We see Christ and John, them talking to each other. Judas is the man in red who's leaning away. A dog and cat, which are often shown in Last Suppers. You saw them in Tintoretto's. Possibly the antagonism of Judas and Christ, though I've heard some positive identifications of the cats as well. That may be more modern. But you'll notice that there are servants and other people here. There's more. There's servants. There's dwarves. They'd be like, the court jester kind of person, the person that this very rich man has his own dwarf around his home. And there are just all of these extraneous figures. It looks like there's some guards there, too. So just everything's embellished. Okay. This has a very interesting story. The artist was called before the Inquisition. Now, this is the Venetian Inquisition. It's not the Spanish Inquisition. But it's still terrifying. This painting is why he was called before the Inquisition. Why? The Council of Trent, that Counter-Reformation church council of the mid-16th century, had ruled that religious paintings must be decorous. Now, what did they mean by decorous? They meant dignified and appropriate to the subject. And so Veronese was called before the Inquisition on the charge that his Last Supper was not decorous. And he gets to make a defense. And it's longer than this, but these are the key words that we're going to talk about. He says that we painters take the same license that poets and jesters take. You've heard of poetic license. Well, this is painter's license as well. We take the same license that poets and jesters take. I paint pictures as I see fit, and as well as my talent permits. Well, the judges weren't buying it. Now, they weren't going to execute him over this, but they had a verdict, and they said, you must change the painting. You must eliminate the indecorous figures, people picking their teeth, dwarves. No, it's just indecorous. How's he going to do that? The painting's huge. It's 42 feet wide. It took years to paint. Probably. He's not going to be getting any more money for it when he does it. If he has to repaint the whole thing, what's he going to do? Oh, he's clever. He changed the title. That's All he did, he changed the title. Can you see right here on that molding at this great pedestal at the base of the column, right above and to the right of this the little child that's leaning over, it says Luca, C-A-P for chapter 5, the Roman numeral V. The Roman numeral 5, it looks like a V. He painted a new biblical source on the balustrade. Just right there. And he said, okay, it's not a Last Supper anymore. It's a feast in the house of Levi. Remember who Levi was? Levi was Matthew, the tax collector, a rich guy. So we have this rich man's house here. And, rich men can have buffoons, they can have dwarves, they can have people picking their teeth at their dinner if they want to. They can have dogs, they can have lots of servants. Because the feast in the house of Levi is not a sacrament. It's a narrative scene. It's when, Christ calls Levi to be his apostle. But it's no longer indecorous because it no longer represents a sacrament. And he got away with it. So that painting is no longer the Last Supper. It is now called Feast in the House of Levi. And it hangs in the Accademia Museum in Venice. We're looking at the church of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. Now, this was the church that houses the Last Supper by Tintoretto that we just looked at. But what we want to talk about is the architecture. San Giorgio Maggiore means something like St. George Major, or Big St. George, in Venice, the major church of St. George. And it is a monastery church, and it's in an island that if you are standing in the Piazza San Marco between the Doge Palace and the library, and you're looking out over the bay, this is what you're looking at. And the photograph was actually taken on a Vaporetto, or a water bus, going out to the island to see the church. And the church was designed by Palladio. Now, Palladio is an architect from the Veneto. The Veneto is the area around Venice. He's actually from Vicenza, and some of his works are in Vicenza and the vicinity, and some of his buildings are in Venice. Now, the name Palladio is actually a nickname. He had a humanist patron who gave him a classical education and a classical nickname. Palladio comes from Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Not only is he an architect, but he is also an author. He wrote the book called The Four Books of Architecture. So we have architectural theory, but he's also practical because he is actually creating works of art. He is actually creating works of architecture. He is very interested in such things as the classical proportions, the proportions of buildings, of columns. And he's very influential on neoclassical architects of the 18th century. And that includes the famous neoclassical architect Thomas Jefferson. You may know him as the third president of the United States. So here we're approaching San Giorgio Maggiore. And here we are looking at the interior. And you can see, of course, it has a hemispheric dome on the top. It has rounded arches, classical columns. You can't see where the Last Supper is from this view. You actually would have to go behind the altar into what I believe would probably be where the choir of monks would have sat. And there is it is a huge painting of the Last Supper by Tintoretto on one wall, and on the facing wall is the Gathering of the Manna, also by Tintoretto. Now, what we're going to look at here is particularly the facade, or the front of the church. One of the problems that Renaissance architects had was how to reconcile classical architecture with the needs of a Christian church. Christian basilica churches, and this is a Christian church that has a long hallway, which we call a nave, ending in the apse or the altar end. They usually had side aisles, which were lower than the nave. And they had the liturgy performed within the church, so people could come into the church and they could focus on the altar at the far end. However, classical temples are not built that way. Classical temples are usually built to house the statue of the god or goddess. Sometimes they'll have, for example, a treasury, such as the Parthenon. But the rites and the rituals, which are often animal sacrifices, would be performed outside the temple. And people would come into the temple individually to pay homage to the deity. So it's a totally different kind of ceremony than you have in a Christian church, which takes place within the church and focuses on the altar where the sacrifice is, as I said, the bloodless sacrifice of Christ. The sacrifice of the bread and wine transformed into the body and blood of Christ. So you have a tall nave, and then you have two lower sections, and this is to allow a row of windows to go down the nave, and then the lower sections are the side aisles. Okay. Well, how do you reconcile this? Well, there's been a couple of different ways of doing it. Alberti just covered up the whole facade. He had chapels rather than side aisles with what looked like a classical temple facade. Palladio also uses a classical temple facade, but what he does is superimpose two classical temple facades. Okay, so what are we talking about here? We have, as you can see, what looks like a taller facade. You have this triangular section that we call a pediment. And we have the horizontal section, the entablature, supported by columns. Here they're half columns that are engaged columns. They're attached to the wall rather than an open portico that you would have in a classical temple. But here they go right up to the front of the church. And to get the proportions right, he also has plinths or pedestals or something to stand the columns on, because otherwise you'd have these tall columns going down to the ground and the proportions would be wrong. So he lifts up a abbreviated classical temple facade and he superimposes that on another classical temple facade, which looks more, shorter, more squat. And this covers up the side aisles. And so you have the pediment that seems to go behind the taller section. And instead of columns, we have pilasters. If you would take a column and attach it to the wall, we call it an engaged column. If it is flattened, here it looks kind of like a square pillar that has been flattened and attached to the wall, that's a pilaster. And so we have two superimposing classical temple facades of different heights on the church facade. And Palladio actually used this. Solution in a couple of buildings, one of which we're seeing here. We looked at one of Palladio's churches, and now we're going to look at some domestic architecture. Now, this is domestic architecture for a very wealthy person. This is known as the Villa Rotunda, or the Villa Capri, which is outside Vicenza. Now, it's called the Villa Rotunda because it has a round core, a round center, a rotunda underneath the dome. The Villa Capri because it was the Capri family, I think. Leave that out. Let's do that again because I think it's the family name, but it might be a place name. So let's just leave that out. Okay. It's called the Villa Rotunda because it has a rotunda, or a round room, which is it's called the Villa Rotunda because it has a rotunda, or a round room with a dome above it, right in the center of the structure. Now, a villa is a country house for a wealthy person. Generally, they would have a palazzo, a palace, if you will, which is his townhouse, his lavish town. Generally, he would have a palazzo, Generally, he would have a palazzo, or a palace, which is his townhouse or his city house. And then when he goes out to his country estate, he would have his villa, or his country house. So this is the Villa Rotunda. Now you can see exactly what the model is for Palladio's Villa Rotunda. And we're going to show you how he used the Pantheon, which was a classical, we're going to show you how he used the Pantheon, which is a classical temple dedicated to all the gods, as his model. And as you can see, you have this dome at the top, which we're just seeing the top of the dome on both of them. You have a rotunda in the center, a round room, which is like the Pantheon is a round temple. And then you have a portico, a classical temple facade, which is a porch on the outside. Now, Palladio has to have more rooms, more places for living than you would in the temple. And he also puts 4 porticos on it. This is an absolutely symmetrical design. As you can see, he has a square building, absolutely centralized, with the rotunda surmounted by the dome in the center. And then on all 4 sides, there are staircases going up to the porch or portico, which has, of course, the pediment, entablature, and columns. This actually has 3 levels. The bottom story, you can see, is what below the staircase. The main floor, which they would call the Piana Nobile. We would call it the second floor, but in Europe this would be the first floor. You have the ground floor and then the first floor. And the Piana Nobile, or the main floor, the second floor, or first floor European, is where you would have your most important rooms, such as your reception areas. And then there's a small third story, as you can see. This was a very influential building And here I'm showing you two 18th century houses. One is English, and the other you may recognize. It's American. One is Chiswick House in West London, designed by Lord Burleigh. And the other is Monticello near Charlottesville, Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson as his home. And you can see that in both cases, they have a rotunda, in this case an octagonal rotunda with a dome, octagonal dome, and a portico out front, which has the entablature, the pediment, and the columns. We'll actually be talking about Monticello later on in the course. But it shows you the wide influence of Palladio.